Hey everybody, my name is Robert Gonzalez and I'm a science reporter at io9.com. I'm here today at the American Museum of Natural History to talk about some recent findings on dinosaur feathers. Joining me today are Mark Norell. Norell is the Paleontology Division's chairman and curator here at the museum, and a lot of his research revolves around the origin of birds and the groups of dinosaurs to which birds are most closely related. Also joining us is Mick Ellison. Mick is a senior principal artist, also in the museum's division of paleontology. Mick works closely with Mark and other paleontologists at the museum to help conceptualize what long-extinct animals might have looked like. They were both involved in research that is being published in today's issue of Science magazine on Microraptor. Microraptor was a small, four-winged dinosaur that lived over 100 million years ago in the forests of what is now China. And now, without further ado, I'd like to talk to you both a little bit about your findings. Sure. I was hoping we could start out by talking a little bit about what we knew about Microraptor, or what we thought we knew about Microraptor before this paper was published.
Well, actually, we knew quite a bit about Microraptor because it's known from a number of specimens. And Mick and I have had the opportunity to study the Microraptor specimens basically since they were first discovered about 10 years ago. And what we knew about it previous to this was that it was a small animal. It was related to some other very familiar dinosaurs, things like Velociraptor and that Dromaeosaurs is the group that it belongs to. We also knew that it was covered with feathers. And while that sounds pretty novel to a lot of people, that a feathered dinosaur, why isn't it a bird? It's much more closely related to animals like Velociraptor, like Troodon, than it is to any modern bird, even though it looks rather bird-like in appearance. So that we knew all of that, but we didn't know what color it was. We didn't know whether or not that it may have used some of the same sort of social signaling and stuff that we see in modern birds today, and that's really what this paper is about.
That's really cool. So something that you mentioned is that at first glance, if you guys could bring up number 4, Microraptor might look to somebody today very much like a bird that they would find just out and about at first glance. But soon after seeing it, they'd realize that this is something that is very unique and very different from birds of today. And part of the reason for that is that this is in fact a non-avian dinosaur. I was hoping you guys could flesh out the distinction between non-avian dinosaurs and the birds that we know today.
Yeah, well, I think that you have to really think of it as hierarchical. That humans were primates and we're also mammals. So humans are a kind of primate, and us, mice, deer, whatever, are all kinds of mammals. Birds are a kind of dinosaur. And that what's been really exciting to be a dinosaur paleontologist over the last couple of decades is really that what we've started to learn is that a lot of these things that we used to think that were just totally characteristics of modern birds, things like feathers, things like hollow bones, wishbones, all these kinds of things, are embedded really deeply inside of the dinosaur family tree, the non-avian dinosaur family tree. So the way we have to look at it is that all living birds are more closely related to one another than any of them are to things like Microraptor or Velociraptor. And what we've learned, though, is that things like Microraptor and Velociraptor and even Tyrannosaurs had feathers. So it's just a characteristic that's embedded really deeply within the dinosaurian family tree.
Yeah. And one of the things that's really interesting about those feathers, like you said, is that in recent years you guys have been able to take a look at them and figure out what color they might have been. How do you exactly go about doing that?
Well, the color issue really comes from that there's organelles, small bodies that exist in the feathers that contain pigment. And that by looking at the organelles, actually, Matt Shockey, who's the lead author in the paper, was the one who has done a lot of the work on this, that you can mathematically describe the shapes of these organelles in living birds. And these are small. That they're only a few microns across. So
you can fit 100 of them across a
yeah,
human hair.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that if you look at the shapes, though, you're able to predict what color the animal was by this mathematical deconstruction of the shape, and that it works for living birds today. So these specimens from northeastern China are so exquisitely preserved that we're able to look at these same organelles, and even though that they don't preserve the colors, we can predict what color they were by the shape of these things.
So the organelles you're specifically talking about, those are melanosomes.
The melanosomes, right.
And basically by comparing those two modern-day birds, you've been able to infer what this
Right.
bird's plumage would have looked like.
Yeah, and there's two aspects of it. Plumage in living birds is both pigments, okay, like things like melanin, things like some carotenoids, but it's also structural color. And structural color comes from the arrangements of the melanosomes or other aspects of the feather relative to just other parts of the feather. So that is what causes the iridescence in this animal, because if you look at a bird like a peacock or a hummingbird or a grackle or a crow, especially in grackles and crows, you see this blue-green iridescence, and that's because of the way the melanosomes are packed with one another, sort of end to end, instead of just being arranged in a different way. So, in addition to being able to tell that this animal is black, we can say that it was iridescent, which
Right.
is something which, if somebody would have told me that 15 years ago when we first started finding these sort of fossils in northeastern China, I said, no way we're ever going to figure any of this stuff out. But,
Right.
We've moved a long way.
Yeah, and I actually spoke on the phone with Dr. Shockey
Uh-huh.
a couple of days ago, and something that he said to me that really stuck out was that this sort of research, the comparisons that you're making between this prehistoric dinosaur and modern-day birds, would have been impossible as recently as 3 or 4 years ago. Why is that?
I think a little bit of, well, it's a lot of reasons. I mean, some is we have exquisite new fossils, which always helps. Second is that I think just the questions that paleontologists are asking these days are very different than they used to do in the old days. That, that it's less about kind of just naming new kinds of animals and more biological questions about, what color were they? How did they behave? So we're starting to approach the field very differently. Also that some of these, big databases are being built now, like the one that Bruce made and stuff, that about, how the melanosomes that, compare with feathers in modern birds. So, I think that that's always good also. And, we've been able to, the age of the internet, the age of computers, the age of video conferencing has allowed these big consortia of lots of different people who
Right. This is
approach
an
problems
international
kind of like
collaboration.
exactly.
Yeah.
We have the Chinese guys, we have the Julia and Austin, we have Matt's work and stuff, so it's really good.
Very cool. And Julia was involved in the research that was I guess you would call it the former record holder for an iridescent feather before this, right?
Yeah, it was from
Something
the Messel
47
from
million
Germany, right?
Yeah.
It's a well-known place, so that's
Very cool. So you mentioned briefly the emergence of really, really spectacular specimens. When you come across a specimen that looks as good as this one did, and if you guys could bring up image number 1 here, this was an exceptionally well-preserved specimen.
Yes.
Correct?
yes.
And when you have a specimen that has been preserved that well, it's a really great opportunity to sort of take that and reconstruct what this animal might have looked like. And one of the ways you can do that is to bring in a science artist like Mick, and to have them sort of basically reconstruct this animal from the ground up. Could you talk a little bit about what goes into that and how that works?
Yeah, sure. I'm lucky to work with these Chinese fossils because the preservation is just exquisite, like this Microraptor fossil. So what my job is, if I'm reconstructing a fossil, I'm trying to maybe flesh it out and portray the way that animal may have looked when it was alive. And I have to, first, you begin with the fossil. What kind of evidence do you have? And luckily, with these specimens, a lot of times you have these beautiful soft tissues which are preserved within the fossil itself. So I look at something like Microraptor, like this fossil, and you can see on image number 1 that several of the wings of Microraptor are actually still preserved within that fossil block. So, and we've seen this over and over again. With Mark, we've been traveling to China for me, I've been traveling almost 15 years. With Mark, we've seen many, many specimens. I've been able to look at all of the different Microraptor fossils, compare each one, and then slowly, over time, build a picture of what this animal may have looked like.
That's great. And one of the things you mentioned is that there were a lot of fossilized feathers in this particular specimen, and that allowed you guys to sample melanosomes from several different sites from around the bird, correct?
Right.
And you guys discovered that this thing was most likely pretty much entirely black, with this sort of light blue iridescence to it.
Right, right.
Talk about why that's important in the context of, what this animal behaved like. I mean, it's one thing to know what it looked like, but it's another to say well, seeing that it had these features, we can infer this about its day-to-day life?
I mean, I think it relates to a couple of different things. I mean, it's that, one is just it's part of the creativity of being a scientist. It's just that, I mean, for me, the big thrill is not what color it was. The big thrill is that we were clever enough to figure it out. I mean, that's kind of what keeps me going, doing this stuff and everything. But as far as how it behaved, I think the question is still really out there of whether this animal could fly or glide. I mean, certainly it didn't fly with powered flight the way modern birds do. I mean, that's a no-brainer. But also that even whether it was a glider, I think, is still sort of an open question that a lot more research needs to be done. One thing we can say, and this is just by comparison with modern birds, is that in living birds today, there's no dark-colored or black birds that are nocturnal.
Right.
And there's been some suggestions that these animals were nocturnal. And certainly I think by, if we, as I always talk to my students, I talk to other people about how that the best way to understand the past is to really understand the present. And if you're to look at modern birds today, that there's no black birds that fly at night.
Right.
So I think that we can say that this animal is probably diurnal.
That's awesome. Yeah, and if those of you who are online looking at this webcast from the internet, if you go on Google and if you search for Microraptor, you'll notice that most of the images that depict this dinosaur show it as sort of like a mottled brown color or something like that. You'll also notice that its tail feathers are often depicted in this really flat, broad teardrop shape. And this new specimen also allowed you guys to figure out that that probably actually wasn't what it looked like.
Yeah, actually, like a lot of the feathering stuff is stuff because Mick is, reconstructing these animals, is working on this project as an artist, and he took some of the hardest looks at figuring out what the feathers were like and stuff.
There's also the fact that it was these sort of two streamers, like almost, at the end of the tail instead of a big, broad, flat tail feather is also suggestive of that sort of show feature, right?
Yeah, and that seems to be a common motif that has evolved several times within birds. I mean, in living birds today, we have things like, tropic birds and birds of paradise that have. They also have these tail streamers, and it's not something which we think that is evolved, one time and all birds did it, but it just seems to be something that's come up repeatedly within bird evolution, is that these adornments of the tail that were probably used for sexual selection.
Right. Very cool. Well, that's a good, I think, foundation to work with. I think we're going to go now to Twitter. If you guys want to submit questions online, you can do it with the hashtag DinoFeathers. You can also submit questions via email at, I think it's comments@amnh.org. We've got a few lined up here already. So Graciela in Argentina has a question. She asks, what can you say about the geological setting where these fossils were found?
We can say quite a bit, just because this is this area, everything was preserved, from plants, from insects, and other things. I mean, it was an area that was primarily hardwood forest.
And you're talking the hard beds in China, correct?
In China, yeah, where the specimen was discovered. It was a temperate forest. It wasn't subtropical, but it was very much like sort of deciduous forests that we see today. Also, the reason that these animals are so spectacularly preserved is a lot of them may have even been killed by volcanic gassing, and then they were quickly buried by very fine-grained volcanic ash. So because of that, they weren't desiccated, they weren't predated on, they weren't scavenged, so that we get these things like feather preservation.
And you guys have found a lot of dromaeosaur there, correct?
Yes.
And that's been super helpful in sort of reconstructing.
Really, it has.
Yeah.
I think that to people in mixed business and stuff, the fossils from Liaoning have been really changed the way that artists perceived dinosaur fossils, and therefore then that the general public does, because that they're the vehicle that this stuff gets transmitted through.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you see that in something like Jurassic Park, right, where the first movie there were no dinosaurs with feathers, and then the subsequent sequences, boom, they're everywhere. Yeah, that's really cool. Sam on Facebook would like to know what differentiates the iridescence that you guys are inferring from these feathers from what might be the result of, say, minerals deposited during the fossilization process?
We don't see a lot of what's called diagenesis in these fossils. I mean, that if you look at even the fossils are so well preserved, is that even if you look at them using the technique we use, scanning electron microscopy, you find that the scans that you see look identical to the scans that you would do of a modern feather. So it's just, we feel strongly that this isn't some secondary overprint.
Very representative.
Very representative.
Expect to see. Very cool. Also from Sam is basically a follow-up question was how you could determine that this color is of biological origin and not as opposed to, say, an artifact.
Well, again, the shape of the melanosomes correspond very, very well with the shape of the melanosomes in modern birds. So you just use the same sort of mathematical deconstructions of the shape of the melanosomes that you would do on a modern bird feather, and then use different kinds of statistics, factor analysis, and things like that to be able to apply statistical confidence to it. So.
Yeah. You mentioned the shape of the melanosomes. Something I recall reading was that the more spherical melanosomes tend to take on this sort of rust-colored appearance.
Yes.
Whereas the more longer rod-shaped ones tend to take on a darker, like a black or gray appearance.
Right. Exactly. So I mean, if you look at the database that Matt put together and stuff, you're able to just sequentially differentiate lots of different colors by just these shapes.
Right.
So.
And as that database grows in size, the easier it will be for you guys to reference it and make comparisons. And right now that database has something on the order of like 160, 170 different.
But but it's not just 170. It's 170 of carefully chosen ones that represent the entire spectrum of feather diversity within living birds.
Right, and that's a whole bunch of species too, right? Those aren't, and some of those are duplicates or triplicates.
Exactly. So.
Very cool. And is that, I'm assuming that just continues to grow all the time.
Oh, it does. So.
That's awesome. Very cool. Another question from Argentina was, besides the color, were you able to establish any other features leading to some conclusions related to Microraptor's environmental conditions?
Well, I think that the environment, obviously vertebrate fossils are so rare that determining environmental conditions on the basis of a vertebrate fossil is really hard. It's kind of like, you could look at the skeleton of a mountain lion here in the southwest of the United States and compare that with the skeleton of a leopard from subtropical India, and they'd look pretty much the same.
Yeah.
So, if you want to study environment, things like that, you need to use geochemistry, or you need to look at plants, or you need to look at things that are far less charismatic than dinosaurs.
Dinosaurs are pretty charismatic.
I said far less charismatic than dinosaurs.
Twitter user would like to know, can purely structural colors, such as the blue in a peacock's neck, be discerned in fossil feathers?
Yeah, well, that's really what we did, or most of what Matt did and stuff, because by just looking at the architecture of the way in which the melanosomes are distributed relative to one another, of whether they're all piled on top of one another sort of like randomly, or whether that they're ordered in such a way that they may diffract light, is what we found, and also what the other group who did the work on the mesyl feather for iridescence found as well. So that when these things work as diffraction gratings, or like little prisms to be able to blast out those colors.
Right. There's sort of like a primary level where it's the individual colors of the melanosomes themselves, and then the secondary structure of them.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's amazing. And another follow-up question to that was that the impression, one Twitter user said that he had the impression that Microraptor had somewhat elongated feathers on its thumbs, and wanted to know if that was a preservational artifact.
Yeah, you can speak to that.
In modern birds, they have an alula, which would be, you could call that a thumb feather, and we've seen in several of these Microraptor specimens evidence that there is some kind of feather preservation, some kind of soft tissue preservation where that thumb feather would be. So,
would that have served a functional purpose, or?
Well, perhaps. The alula, the true alula, first appears in a group of birds called enantiornithines, which are clearly, more closely related to modern birds than things like Archaeopteryx are, and the presence of an alula is a very aerodynamic feature that helps animals when they're going through the air. Now, I think that while we don't think that this animal could fly, or have powered flight, it may have had some gliding capability, and what we might be seeing is some sort of very nascent stage in the the origin of the modern flight wing.
Right. Cool. There was a question here that I definitely wanted to get to. We actually touched on it briefly a second ago. A Twitter user asked if they found out if it was black all around or if they only checked a few spots. And we mentioned earlier that this was a particularly well-preserved specimen, and that allowed you guys to look at, I think it was, high 20s, like 29 different spots throughout the bird, the dinosaur.
Yeah.
And that's, as you mentioned earlier, really unprecedented in this kind of specimen. I think you mentioned Archaeopteryx a second ago. And there was a paper published a few months ago that that found that Archaeopteryx likely had black plumage, but they were going on one feather.
Right.
So could you talk about how that can be sort of a challenge when trying to depict what these animals look like?
Well, I mean, it's always a challenge because and it's something that we're hoping in the next generation of these studies to be able to do it a little bit differently. I mean, when you have a beautiful specimen like the one in picture number 1, that a lot of times it's really difficult to persuade people to say, okay, we're going to go in and we're going to take a bunch of samples of this, because it is destructive sampling. I mean, it does mess up the specimen a little bit to be able to look at it. But as our techniques are getting better and changing it, we think that we'll be able to supersede some of that and perhaps do totally non-invasive things in the future. It is always hard to be able to even take one sample. I mean, a couple years ago, I was fortunate enough to work on a project where we were looking at growth in Archaeopteryx, and the Archaeopteryx are sort of the holy icons to paleontologists and stuff, and to be allowed to be able to take a chunk of one of those things off, to be able to say, okay, we're going to take a piece off and then we're going to cut it up. I mean, that was a difficult negotiation, but we were able to do it. And so it's always hard to do this kind of stuff. But at the same time, I mean, we find out so much, and I mean, it's like anything, what good are fossils if we can't really study them?
Yeah. Yeah, it's always the sort of cost benefit you got to go with, right?
Exactly.
That's very cool. A classroom watching this in Brooklyn, New York would like to know what the dimensions of the Microraptor were.
Well, the different specimens are different sizes, but in general, they're mostly pigeon-sized. Maybe a large crow, pigeon-sized.
So we're looking at a black, iridescent, four-winged pigeon?
Basically, yeah.
From 130 million years ago? That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Let's see if we've got any here. Do we have any that are coming in over email that we could look at right now? I haven't seen any here. Here's a question from a user on Facebook would like to know. He says, one ornithologist I know said that the microstructures may indicate a certain color, but that would not necessarily reveal what that color or feature was in life, since other factors can influence the appearance of the feather as well. You mentioned earlier some of the keratin and stuff. Yeah. The perfect example, says this user, is a flamingo. Its feather color comes from the pigments in algae, yet its feather structure would read as white.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. I mean, that there's these two different ways in which feathers are colored. One is the structural color, like diffraction. The other is pigment color, like melanosomes. In addition to that, there's another class of colors that make up the really flashy colors, like the bright yellows and oranges and greens and blues that we see in lots of living birds. And the molecules that impart that color are carotenoids primarily. And carotenoids are very, very, very fragile molecules, which don't seem to, they don't preserve very well.
They don't hold up against 130 million years of...
So
they don't even hold up after a week.
Yeah, I mean, it's like we know that here because even that, flamingos are a good example. Other birds are a good example that, that they're very susceptible to breakdown by UV light. Even specimens that have been kept in dark museum cases for 100 years and stuff, that the color is totally washed out.
They still see that sort of degradation really quickly.
Yeah. We are doing some experiments that I'm involved in now that's trying to look for secondary degradation products of carotenoids. So I think that one day with the right kinds of sensitive instruments we'll be able to figure this out. But for the time being, I mean, we're pretty much restricted to the eumelanin and pheomelanin and stuff, which impart these black colors or ruddy red colors and stuff that we see in living birds.
Which still, the potential for that is obviously enormous because,
it is,
as we mentioned earlier, this is a really, really, really young field in terms of looking at
very much
the paleobiology of these creatures.
So.
Do you guys expect to see a lot more of these sort of studies coming out in the not too distant future?
Well, I think so. I mean, a lot of it is that we're really limited by really fantastic specimens.
Yeah.
And that there's a lot of Microraptor specimens out there now. So as specimens like Microraptor, like Anchiornis, like some of these other things become better and better known and more of them are around, then it's a lot easier to convince museum curators and administrators at other places to let us sample them.
For the sampling.
Yeah.
Very cool. Dana via email would like to know what the benefits the Microraptor may have benefited from on account of the color of its feathers. Was it for camouflage? Would it have helped it find food? And in what strata of the forest might it have lived?
I mean, that's all good questions, but like, I mean, as far as that, I mean, I think that, again, if we look at living birds today, I mean, there's been a lot of work on the sociobiology of living birds, and that quite a bit of it, I mean, if you look at figure 3 or 4, that, you look at these animals and stuff, and you can see that, the long tail feathers that stick out. We feel strongly that's for display, for trying to attract mates, for signaling to other members of your own species. The iridescence also was probably for that. Certainly, I don't feel that any birds that are alive today, like crows or starlings, blackbirds, grackles, and stuff, use their black color necessarily for camouflage. I mean,
right.
To me, it's all about showiness,
it's all
display.
About
yeah, exactly.
Very cool.
Exactly.
Something that I think we should also talk about in the context of the evolution of flight is what these findings mean in terms of why 130-million-year-old dinosaurs may have evolved feathers in the first place. This sort of suggests that it might not have been solely for the purposes of flight, correct?
Yeah, I think we know that conclusively because certainly that there's animals which are much more distantly related to modern birds than Microraptor, which were completely feathered. And the first times that we find feathers on dinosaurs in the fossil record and stuff is that the feathers don't look anything at all like the feathers that we think of as feathers, of having a central rachis and then veins that come off of them. I mean, they're more like little hairs, and they're quite short.
Yeah.
And so I think that you can easily make the argument, like a number of us have, that you start out with kind of just a fluffy body covering, probably as an insulation blanket to keep warm, and then that becomes elaborated as display structures, and then finally that becomes co-opted for feathers that are involved in flight.
Right. Awesome. Wild Yoga on Twitter would like to know, what are the next steps in studying this feather and fossil? What do you see happening in the near or distant future?
I don't know. I mean, it's I mean, I'll be in Beijing next week, so I'll see what they've got, everything as far as what's next. But
is it that organic, the process of in terms of finding things that you work with or finding people to collaborate with on this sort of study?
Not really, because we have a pretty tight network of people that we've worked with for years. I mean that we've been very fortunate here at the museum and stuff to have a number of students and postdocs who've come through who now occupy positions of authority in China and Argentina and other places. So that and we're still all friends with one another. We still all work together. So it's kind of worked out. So.
Yeah. So I imagine that really facilitates the research process.
Oh, it really does, and I mean, and also just being able to work with people who just aren't scientists. I mean, my collaboration with Mick on a lot of these projects and stuff has been great because it's really allowed us to be able to, too often that people who are in my kind of position, we have to both take photographs, do the art, as well as write, do the research, and not only am I freed from that by having Mick do the artistic aspect of it, it's always great to have the eyes of another really careful observer and stuff when you're looking at some of this stuff to say, well, check this out, it's a little different than this other one and stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely.
So that always works.
Something I'd also like to hear a little bit more about from Mick. There's a really great profile of you on the New York Times website right now. They did a short little featurette. Something that you mentioned on there that I was interested in was you said a lot of your job revolves around photography, not necessarily drawing.
Yeah, that's true. Because I'm an artist within the research area of paleontology, any drawing that's created is going to be subjective. So we rely on photography most often to just get an accurate image of what that fossil actually is. Yeah. So maybe in the past, artists would have reconstructed fossil bones. They would have filled in areas that were missing, but they were always bringing something into that with their own imagination, and maybe you can't rely on that too much. So we try to hold a conservative edge, and we stick mostly with photography.
That's cool. But at the same time, and this is something I also heard you mention in that little featurette, by spending more time drawing it, physically drawing it, you come to realize a more intimate relationship with it.
Oh, absolutely.
And understand it better and sort of be able to...
Absolutely. And I see a lot of students and scientists doing the same thing. It's a great activity. When people discover that if they're studying, say, a specific fossil, a specific bone, whether they're talented at drawing or not, it really doesn't matter. But if you just open a pad and just start to sketch it, it's going to force you to really look at it in a very careful way, and that can only benefit you. You'll begin to really know what you're studying.
Not me though. I just kind of draw stick man.
Yeah, he's terrible.
He's terrible.
He's a terrible artist.
None of my talents, but that's not one of them.
That is rubbed off.
No.
It's not too late to learn.
Yeah.
We've got a question on Twitter that asks, were there feathers on any of the very large dinosaurs, or was it primarily found on smaller ones?
That's a good question. Okay, primarily we know them just on small ones. Certainly we know, though, that some very large dinosaurs, well, not really large, but as juveniles, were feathered. I think that, just to throw a teaser out there, there's going to be some big surprises coming up in the next month or so.
Next month, you say? Awesome. Sounds good. We've got a question over email that asks, what do you speculate they might have eaten? Microraptor, that is. And do you think that they might have lived in trees?
I think it's a good bet they lived in trees. There's a paper that came out by Jingmei O'Connor and Zhezhong He about a month ago where they actually found that the remains of a small true bird in the stomach of a Microraptor. And I think that these animals were like, small little carnivorous animals. I mean, they would have eaten basically anything that was smaller than them. So a lot of the small dinosaurs that we found that are known from this size, even some of the historic specimens in Germany from Solnhofen, like Compsognathus and stuff, have lizards in their stomachs.
Yeah.
And so, they're just small opportunistic predators.
Cool. Good for them.
Yeah.
We've got a question from Twitter that asks, is it possible that Microraptors also brooded their eggs as well, like the oviraptors did that you suggested in 1995?
I think definitely. I mean, because that if we look at that, oviraptors are more distantly related to modern birds than Microraptor is. So since living birds brood their eggs, since oviraptors brood their eggs, that we would expect that behavior to be present in the last common ancestor of both oviraptors and living birds. And since Microraptor is also descended from that common ancestor, in lieu of any other information, we would predict that it would have brooded its nest.
Very cool. See, there was a follow-up question here from the classroom in Brooklyn that I wanted to get to. Here it is. They say, thank you for reading our questions. You're welcome. It says, are there any natural predators of Microraptor that you know of?
Anything with big teeth that was bigger than
Anything
eggs.
Yeah. Maybe other Microraptors.
Yeah, maybe, exactly.
Because some of them are fairly large.
Yeah.
Some of the specimens are quite a bit larger than this one.
I mean, it's like any natural environment. I mean, it's a dog-eat-dog world out there. So, I'm sure these things were heavily predated on by some of the other animals that even other feathered animals like primitive tyrannosaurs like Dilong, which we are from the same area and stuff. That was about 6 feet long. Cynernethosaurus, which is about 3 feet long.
Right,
so.
because I'm under the impression that these things were very, very, very common in the forests of China. I mean, they were probably one of the more popular species there.
I don't know.
It's hard to say.
It's hard to say because, I mean, when you look at the fossil record, if you go to any place to excavate and you find lots of one kind of animal, for instance, that does not necessarily mean it was the most common one.
It might just mean they all died there.
Yeah, the record is really biased in a lot of ways for a lot of different reasons.
Cool. We've got a question from Twitter asking if, since this dinosaur had feathers, is that any strong implication that it was endothermic?
I think that most of us, while we don't have the smoking gun evidence like we have for a lot of things that these animals were endothermic, that living birds are endothermic, and most of us think when we look at all of the evidence that endothermy is something which evolved pretty deep in the theropod dinosaur tree. Certainly some of these animals like, we've been able to work on like tyrannosaurs and things like that, which we've been able to understand how fast they grew. I mean, tyrannosaurs, for instance, for a very long period of their life, about a 12-year period of their life, were growing at about 6 pounds a day. And just sustaining those kind of growth rates is very hard to do if you're an ectotherm. So there's a lot of other tangential evidence about the structure of the brain, about the structure of other parts of the body, which all suggest that these things were. Now, I hope that somebody will be smart enough to figure out a way in which that using geochemistry or something else as a paleothermometer to be able to figure out whether, in fact, these animals are truly endothermic like living birds are. But I think that all the data points to strongly that they were.
Right. Very cool. We've got a question from Melanie by email. She says, we have been following your work online and by a video of your dig in the Gobi Desert. What advice do you have for a 5-year-old budding paleontologist who also happens to be your biggest fan?
Cool.
I don't know. I mean, get a good education. Work hard.
Study up.
Study up. Try to go to a good grad school. And then, but you also, I mean, quite frankly, though, it's something like I even tell students when I'm interviewing, if you're going to do this for a living, you really have to want it, because there's not a lot of jobs out there.
Yeah.
And I mean that I think that some of my colleagues have likened these sorts of positions to athletic careers. I mean that there's a lot more people who want to play in the NBA than actually can, no matter. And in some cases, it's no matter even how good they are and stuff. It's just that the number of positions is few and far between, which, I don't want to dissuade people. I mean, I think people should know a lot about paleontology and things like that. But if you look at the trials and tribulations of some of my, current students and stuff, of them trying to find positions, it's just really tough out there.
Right. So it's a hard road.
It's a hard road.
But if you're going to start, you might as well start when you're 5.
Yeah.
That's good. What about people who are interested in becoming, for example, a science artist?
Back when I was in art school, I wasn't even aware that there was such a thing as scientific art. But today, thankfully, because that was back in the dark ages, but today there's plenty of programs. I know of a few that just specialize in scientific illustration. So if you're focused and that is a route that you are interested in taking, there are programs out there, and they're very good.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Let's see if we've got any more coming in here on the iPad. Follow-up question from Wild Yoga on Twitter asks, you said some specimens were bigger. How many specimens did you work with, and what was their size range?
Well, the first Microraptor specimen I saw was probably, if that's pigeon-sized, maybe chicken-sized.
No, the first one's smaller than that. It's that one.
Oh, right. Yeah,
one.
that was the tiny one.
Yeah,
so
that was about quail size.
Right. So we've seen them, maybe ranging from this large to the largest, which was maybe, with the tail included, was pretty big. Yeah. Fairly large.
Wow. And sorry, you mentioned how many specimens was that you looked at?
Well, we've seen a lot of specimens, like in museums all through northeastern China. Of ones which were incorporated into this study were ones that have been published before. And I think that was 8 or 9 specimens.
Yeah, those were the cited ones. But then, there's the countless. You're in maybe some small town, and there's a provincial museum, and as you're leaving, you open a drawer, and there's this exquisite Microraptor specimen. The whole wing is preserved, and the drawer is shut. It's like, let's move on, and you're like, wait a minute.
No pictures.
Yeah, no pictures.
Yeah, and that's
it sticks with you, though. You memorize it.
That's something we were talking about a little bit before the webcast started, was that, there may be more specimens out there than you even know about, right?
Yeah, there
this
are.
is just
because in addition to the ones that we've seen in both the big collections like Shenyang, Beijing, Chaiyang, then there's the small, really regional museums. But then there's a whole other layer. There's all this stuff on the black market that's been sold illegally, exported illegally. That you see it in private collections around the world, or you see it in private collections or for sale, and by kind of a black market places and stuff. So that there's a lot of specimens out there.
Yeah, I'm from Tucson, Arizona.
Yeah,
where they
of
have
course.
the Gem and Mineral.
Every year.
Okay,
Every
you've
year.
seen it.
Every
All the
year.
dinosaur
It's
eggs.
brought-
and-
There's some segment on the news about black market.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Dinosaurs.
Oh yeah,
Dinosaur beans.
all the time.
We've got another question on Twitter that asks, what does this finding suggest with reference to the trees down versus ground up debate?
I think what they're talking about is the origin of flight, as whether that true flapping flight occurred from animals which were cursors, and so they were running and developed flight that way, or whether it went through an intermediate gliding stage from the trees down. I think that this is a very difficult question, and I think that probably even, it's like a lot of the way science is and stuff. It's always representative of, there's two camps. There's those that think it was trees down, there's those that think it was ground up, or there's those who think that it was warm-blooded, or those who think it's cold-blooded. I mean, it really isn't that way. I mean, the problems are much more complex than that, and probably that the origin of flight is some hybrid of the two. I mean, and it's not just one or the other. As far as how this individual specimen relates to that, it's a little difficult to tell. I mean, I think that some of the work that we did a little bit of it a few years ago, but we've kind of dropped it, but I intend to pick up once again, is just the only way this is really going to be determined is to build super high-resolution models and fly them in wind tunnels.
Right.
And
which to some extent is something that people have been working on.
Yeah, I mean, we've flown models in the wind tunnels at MIT and stuff, and it's just something which that is a lot of work. And again, it's putting together another big consortium of collaborators with people who are actually aerodynamic engineers and things and stuff,
right.
which is something way out of my expertise. And it would be the ideal project if a student wanted to work in my lab or something, and if they wanted to make it their dissertation to do something like that.
That would be awesome.
Work with some of the people at the Flight Lab in Missoula, Montana, which that they really have the finest facilities in the world for flying live birds in wind tunnels, for testing other things. But it's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time, and it's hard.
Yeah, I'd imagine. We've got another question via email that asks, given how much has changed in this field of research in a few short years, do we have any reason to think we might find feathers further down the tree of non-avian dinosaurs?
I think we have. I mean, that there's feather-like structures which have been found in, there's two groups of dinosaurs. One is the Saurischian dinosaurs, so that's like the big traditional sauropod dinosaurs, and the theropod dinosaurs in birds. The other group is the group of animals, which includes horned dinosaurs like Triceratops and duck-billed dinosaurs. In one of the very early members of that group, an animal called Tianyulong, also from this same area in China, it was found with a fluffy body covering. And you can easily argue that things that are like feathers are primitive for all dinosaurs, and that it would have been a common attribute that's present in all of these things. So that I mean, it's kind of an exciting time, because even if you go further down the tree, we know that pterosaurs had flying reptiles had a fluffy body covering as well. So I think this is a very, very ancient feature in these groups, in this group in general.
Here's a question that I've also been curious about: is how common do you see specimens with this sort of four-winged feature?
Well, we've seen a lot.
Yeah. It may go well beyond Microraptor.
Yeah, I mean, there's Anchiornis. I think you can make a good case for it in Sinornithosaurus as well. Yeah. So this is a pretty common motif. I think that the jury is still out of what, in fact, that the hind limb, feathers actually did, is whether they actually were an airfoil and had some aerodynamic use, or whether they were used for something else. Who knows what, but it's pretty common.
Cool.
And even some people even suggested, I mean, Nick Longrich has suggested that Archaeopteryx even had, the most primitive known bird, had a similar sort of architecture of the hind limb, but unfortunately that during the early 20th century that they prepared it off when they were further cleaning the specimens, because he's looked at a lot of old lithographs and stuff of the way the specimens originally looked. And
something is missing here.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
So.
All right, cool. Well, I think that about wraps it up. We've got another question here that I'd like to just throw in at the end. Says, when and where will there be a printed version available of your research, and how can we get it?
Well, I mean, it should be on sciencemag.org. You know, that the paper appeared today. It's a subscription kind of thing. I mean, they're not out there for free, but if you go to it, most libraries have subscriptions to it, and certainly you'll be able to download a PDF.
Sounds good. Cool. Thanks, guys, for talking
Thank
with
you.
us today.